In this video, I'm delighted to be putting this beige 1988 Maestro City through its paces. Oh, this is going to be very enjoyable. Firstly, I said Maestro, not Austin Maestro, and if we come in for a closer look, we can see that it's Maestro badged rather than Austin. It's still got the Austin Rover logo, but that was a deliberate marketing change. They stopped calling them Austins to try and move the image along, although quite what they were hoping to achieve with a beige City, I'm not entirely sure. This was the last year of the City. This is the lowest spec you could buy, but if we head round the back, someone went a bit crazy on this Maestro. They got carried away and ordered a rear wiper. This rear wiper, which came as standard on the City X but not the City, cost £95 and 10 pence, I think it was, when the first owner purchased this car from Selsdon Garage all the way back in, I think it was May 1988. Now, the development of the Maestro, typically lengthy and convoluted, very British Leyland. Early 1970s attention turned to this car. It had the unenviable task of replacing several models within British Leyland as they desperately tried to actually rationalise the cars they offered. Development began in the early 70s. Harris Mann, the man behind the Triumph TR7 and the Austin Allegro, came up with a styling proposal which was very sleek, very cutting edge, but it had a very similar glass area to this car. But ultimately, under David BEIGE, who styled the P6 and the ST1 and tweaked the Range Rover to its final look, he had a chap called Ian Beach working for him who came up with this design, with this controversial scalloping that runs the full length of the car. And I have to say, the looks are perhaps the unhappiest aspect of this car. You would have hoped, after previous disasters like the Allegro was meant to look much sleeker than it did, but Harris Mann's design was butchered to get engines and heater units to fit in it. They would learn that looks are very important. It just doesn't quite hang together nicely, which is a shame because the engineering of the car is very sound and there are some very clever touches. It was one of the first production cars in this class to have a bonded front windscreen, so that's more aerodynamic. You haven't got such a chunky seal, and the windscreen also becomes part of the structure of the car because it's glued into this massive aperture. It helps strengthen it up. The headlights are very unusual. These enormous multifocal units, which they very nearly didn't fit to these models. They almost fitted the smaller ones fitted to the van, but the City eventually got the full size headlamps as well. In terms of under the skin, the engineering was deliberately kept very simple. Charles Spencer King, the man again behind the Range Rover's engineering, the P6, he quickly discovered under British Leyland that there was no money. So the Rover ST1 is a car where the engineering is pared back to very simple stuff, just McPherson struts and coil springs at the back with a live rear axle, and it works really well. He did exactly the same with the Maestro. He freely admitted that they looked at the Volkswagen Golf and said, we need to build that car. So it has McPherson strut front suspension. It has a twist beam torsion bar-esque rear suspension, but with coiled towers as well. That's exactly what the Volkswagen Golf was doing. It went so far that the gearbox is actually from Volkswagen. So I think we should probably have a look in the engine bay. So here is probably the most important engine in the Maestro range. It's the 1.3 A-series engine. It's effectively the A+ engine taken from the Morris Ital and turned through 90 degrees with an end-on gearbox. That gearbox is supplied by Volkswagen. Volkswagen supplied the 4-speed and 5-speed units for the lesser engined Maestros. Now, this engine is ancient. As you can see in a recent video of mine, it was introduced in 1951, but considerable effort went into reworking it in the early 80s for the Metro primarily, and that means it's actually really at home here. It still delivers very good economy, very strong torque characteristics. I mean, it's a pleasure to use. It's just the right amount of car for this engine as well. So we shall find out as we get underway. So the 1.3 A series was the smallest, the old venerable 1275cc, getting on for about 70 brake horsepower. but the rest of the petrol engine range slightly confusing. It began from launch in 1983 with the R series engine, which was a development of the Maxi Allegro E series engine, but in between the two sizes that were offered of that was a 1.6 litres, very important for the fleet market. 1.6 litre was just a very popular category in the UK, and I believe in Europe as well. But that engine only lasted for 2 years, so they developed that engine because they knew the eventual engine, the S series, wouldn't be ready in time. The S series came in with the Montego and was then fitted to the Maestro as well. Much better engine, rubber belt driven camshaft, whereas I think the R series still had a chain set up of the E series. The R series, very short lived, but they did do an MG version as well with twin carbs, bit of a nightmare. The S series engine was much better, although really neither engine had enough punch for the MG badge to really be worth it. That changed when the O series engine was fitted from, I think, 1986, and that was 2 litre, much better power, and then they developed a turbocharged version as well, because there'd been a turbocharged version of the MG Montego. They stuffed that engine into the Maestro. 505 were made, Tickford bodywork to make them look amazing. 0 to 60 times 6.8 seconds. A venerable flying machine, and completely at odds with this simple basic city we have in front of us here. But sadly the performance models didn't really take off, and sales across the Maestro range were never as they had hoped. But we'll talk a bit more about that as we get under the way. So we shall go for a drive now. Just before we hop in, it's worth also mentioning the diesel options. The Perkins Prima diesel engine was offered from, I think it was 1986 in the van version of the Maestro. Very smart looking thing, the van version. Lovely rear styling on it, even if the doors have a habit of not shutting. And then there was a later turbo diesel version, which made this a very capable car. Very strong performance, but still superb 50 mpg, no bother at all. So they were very strong engines and very popular with the fleet market. They just came a bit too late in the Maestro's life. By then sales were already sliding, and the car lingered on in UK production until 1994, I think it was, before production oddly went to Bulgaria, where they were completed from knockdown kits. That wasn't as successful, and then some British companies bought them back in and sold them here. And the last of those was sold as an Apple 2000 in 2001. So you can actually get a Maestro on a 51 plate. And that isn't the end of the story either, because then the design was shipped off to China, where for some reason they fitted the Montego front end to create a Monstro, and they sold them there until 2005. Enough waffle, let's go for a drive. Well, look at this. It's an absolute sea of beige in here. But being a later Maestro, this has the full dashboard taken out of the Montego. Earlier Maestros had a real piecemeal affair that used to shake and rattle, and it wasn't the best effort at all. This being a very basic model, we've got blanking plugs ahoy. There would be a digital clock here in more luxurious models, but we just get Austin and the logo in there. Cigarette lighter, notably absent. Someone has fitted a radio, and I'm not sure if that was fitted from new or not. But some neat features like these heater controls, very 1980s in their graphics. Very easy to use, slightly invisible to see from the driver's seat, but they're nice and easy within reach, and the blower motor is down there. The column stalks, very similar to column stalks used in LDV vans, Land Rovers, Range Rovers even. So we've got the horn on the end, beep, light controls here, and indicators. Thusly with wipers over on this side. No intermittent, because this is a mere city. No mist function either. We just got on, fast, and you press in for a wash. Manual choke fitted, and just down my side we've got the wiper controls. Obviously the first owner rather fancied some luxury, so he went for that. But obviously winding windows, no central locking, a slightly broken mirror in this example, but it's also fresh in here. It's a lovely condition. A little Austin logo lingering on in the light switch there. But how do they drive? I think we should probably find out about that. I'll start the engine up. Fires up very smoothly and very promptly. Some say these gearboxes aren't very nice, and there was some wonder if it was industrial sabotage and Volkswagen had deliberately sent some subpar gearboxes. This one feels quite nice to use. No power steering obviously, but it's quite a large steering wheel, so it doesn't actually feel all that problematic. Just check out blind spots and indicate appropriately. No need for high revs because it's the old A series engine. Very strong torque characteristics, and off we go down the road. We should probably do a windscreen wiper test. So let's do that. Get some. Oh, we only seem to have one washer working, but there is actually enough overlap for the triangle of doom to not be a problem in this case. This example has only done 27,199 miles. The first owner seems to have just used it for the weekly shop and nothing more. And a very practical car for the weekly shop. We shall have a nose in the boot and check out the rear seat later on. Just check this tricky junction. I think the A series engine makes quite a nice noise actually. Very famous, very distinctive noise. It's you know, I drove an Austin 1300 GT from the early 70s and it sounded very similar to this. It's yeah, it's a very good engine really, and it's worth remembering that other rivals had ancient engines. Renault had the Cléon engine, which had its history going right back to the 1940s. But when you start getting more of a shift on, you start realizing that the simple engineering of this car works very, very well. It's effortless to drive, it's comfortable, the ride is really good. I'd say the ride is probably better than an equivalent Golf, to be honest. And when you turn it into a bend, they were always a little under-tired, so they can understeer perhaps a little more readily than some people like. But it just feels very safe and dependable. And while sure, some may have missed the hydrogas suspension of the Allegro and the Princess, it's worth remembering that most people were scared of that system really. There's nothing to be scared of here, it's just simple coil springs. So we are lacking the 5-speed gearbox in this basic city model, so it wouldn't have been ideal on the motorway. Now we're doing an entire 50 miles an hour, it's already starting to feel a bit revvy. But it feels just a vehicle to be bombing along these Welsh lanes in. But I think this is the problem, that there were some very, very clever engineers within British Leyland and companies that made it up. Sir Alec Isagonis being one of them. He would get so focused on his design, he would forget that it needs to be a car that anyone can enjoy, not just people of an engineering bent. He didn't really care for the opinions of customers. And I think that's a key difference with Spen King. Spen King, a formidable engineer, involved with some of the most impressive Rovers ever seen. Yet he was able to realise there were cost implications here, and so came up with a very simple design platform that works very, very well. Now, back in the day, you know, perhaps there were reliability issues, but I think it should be remembered that a lot of cars were problematic, shall we say, in the 1980s. Volkswagen has this reputation for making really good cars. The carburetors in 1980s Volkswagens are rubbish, absolute junk. They have automatic chokes that don't work, and generally, even today, still a bit of a pain. They often get swapped out for Webers and other carburetors that actually work. Now I think perhaps because it's a basic model, there's not all that much sound insulation, so there is a fair bit of engine noise that we can hear. But yeah, you would definitely want the 5-speed gearbox if you're doing motorway work. up against sharper looking competition, the Ford Escort Mark III and Mark IV, and the especially swoopy Vauxhall Astra Mark II. The Maestro looked out of place. That's a shame, because it's actually larger than both and has more interior space, because it's based on the shared platform with the Montego being a Sierra and Cavalier rival. There's a lot more space, so we shall find somewhere to pull over and we'll check out what's going on in the back. Right, practicality. If I get into the rear, there's so much space here and good visibility as well, because there's a huge glass area going on. But look, plenty of knee room, which you didn't necessarily get in some of the competition because they were that little bit smaller. And if we move around to the boot, it's good news here too. It's a good old size. You got these strut towers that eat a little bit into the space, but loads of room really. And if I bring you in, we'll lift up the boot floor, because we've still got all the original fittings in here. Well, I assume that's for removing the wheel trims that you don't even get on a City. But that's still present, and that's a very old tyre. Yeah, it's all beautiful in here. Look at that. Some seam sealer slapped on back in the day. They didn't muck about. But yeah, a very practical car, and very easy to drive because of that superb visibility. You just don't get rear windows like this on cars anymore, do you? I was just thinking to myself, I owned one of these, actually a 1.3L, all sorts of luxury in that, like a center console. But I owned that when I was in my 20s, and I think this sums up the problem with these cars. In my 20s, I just found it dull and boring. I'd already owned a Peugeot 306 by that stage. Peugeot 306 had much better ride and handling. Formidable cars, the 306. But now I'm in my 40s, there's a lot to like about this car, and I think it is the fact that it isn't the most exciting thing, but I like. It just pulls nicely, you don't have to rev it excessively, you can see out of it really nicely, it's comfortable enough, and yeah, that's probably the problem, but it's appealing to me now I'm older. The Maestro always had a fan base with the older motorist, and that was exactly the image the Rover Group wanted to get away from. Hence the sporty Tickford body-kitted MG Maestro. But the looks of this car, we're never going to let it escape that. So I think that highlights the problem very, very well. It is a good car, it's just appealing to the wrong buyers. So there we go, that's the Austin Maestro. It isn't the most exciting car to look at, it's not the most exciting car to drive, but it's worth remembering it in the context of the time. Frankly, a Ford Escort Mark III or Mark IV is not the most exciting car to drive in humdrum flavour, but it is pleasant. It competes well with the competition. It wasn't really given a chance because of its somewhat dumpy looks. I think the looks have aged well, by the way. I think this is now a fine looking car, but back in the day it just didn't quite have the sharpness to compete well. And it's a shame. The Maestro deserved much better. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of weight on this car's shoulders. It had a lot to carry, and it didn't quite pull it off, which is why the Rover-Honda relationship was allowed to blossom. That had rather more success. But still, it's an intriguing bit of UK history, and I'm glad there are so many of them preserved today. So there you go, that is the Austin Maestro. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Don't forget you can head to the Hubnet store and buy lovely merchandise, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Farewell. Didn't mention the fucking diesels.